Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you all for joining me. I know we all have webinars, Zoom fatigue, so I really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday to come learn a little bit more about stalking. So like Stephanie said, my name is Dana Flightman. I'm from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, which is a project of Equitas, and I'm here today to offer our quarterly presentation of Context is Key, Recognizing and Responding to Stalking. This is an especially exciting time because it is Stalking Awareness Month every January, and so we are, as always, excited to talk stalking with you, but especially this month where there's an increased focus on this crime in our field. So, I do these trainings all across the country for audiences including law enforcement, campuses, victim advocates, mental health, all sorts of different professionals who touch our field. And usually I start by asking, and so I'm going to ask Stephanie to pull up this poll here, is this the first time you've had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking? So you can let me know, yep, first training, okay, maybe one or two, or oh my goodness, I could teach this. I don't know why I'm sitting listening to you, Dana. So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, so it looks like there's a mix of folks, and of course, throughout, please feel free to weigh in the chat because we all bring so much experience to this issue, and so definitely, if you have examples that are resonating with you, cases you've worked on, don't hesitate to share or share your insight there. But it looks like from here, maybe 1 in 5 said, oh yeah, I've had stalking training, but about 40% are saying it's my first one or maybe 1 or 2. And so thanks for doing that. And that's really typical, because even really seasoned professionals who are doing wonderful work in our field, which I'm sure many of you are, or all of you are, often have not had the chance to have a training specifically on stalking. It's very undertrained, it's very under-resourced. And just a reminder up front that stalking is one of the 4 crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, but it often kind of is treated as and stalking. We almost called our website andstalking.org because often it's an afterthought. And so I hope that by the end of this session, you're moving that and stalking a little bit more to the beginning of the sentence and seeing the critical work that you're already doing through the lens of stalking and seeing how it can apply to your work. So SPARK is funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking, which means a lot of wonderful things, including that if you want to hear me talk about stalking more, you can. So if you want to follow up training or anything like that, please do reach out after the webinar. Our website is stalkingawareness.org. Did not go with andstalking.org. We have practitioner guides. Those are broken out by discipline. So we have for victim advocates, for law enforcement, as well as for friends and loved ones who are worried about a victim, and for victims themselves. We have training modules that are scripted and include videos. So if you do any kind of public awareness education in your community or on your campus but don't want to reinvent the wheel, we have ready-to-go modules and discussion guides. We have victim resources, so we are not a victim services provider, but we know that victims come to our site. So we include tools that might be helpful, like a documentation log, some safety planning suggestions, and more general information about the crime of stalking, and webinars like this one. So you can listen at your heart's content to myself and our director, Jen Landheis, talk about stalking and different stalking topics. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is @followuslegally. If you get our 6th sense of humor at Spark, if not, it'll be a long hour for you. So really your call either way. I really do recommend that you follow us because we share consistent information about stalking. It can just help raise that awareness year-round, and we're especially active right now. So if you're looking for an easy way to get involved in Stalking Awareness Month, simply sharing some of our posts for your community can go a long way. We also have a newsletter. You can sign up for that on our website. So why learn about stalking besides, okay, it's Stalking Awareness Month and I signed up for this thing? So stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime at the federal level. in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories, on tribal lands, and in the military justice system. It is a crime across the board. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is actually a crime. And so you have victims saying, well, what, should I call the police because somebody keeps driving by my house or texting me? And yeah, they do have the right to a criminal justice response because stalking is a criminal activity. It is a crime, and there is something we can do about it. And it's traumatic. So a lot of times when folks talk about stalking, they go right to the co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is really important. You know, I'll talk about it in just a couple slides. But I want to pause here and point out that even if the stalking in no way intersects with physical violence, it's still a crime in its own right because it is deeply traumatic for victims and survivors. Many experience mental health issues that can be lifelong, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. Quite a few lose time from work. So 1 in 8 lose time. About half of those lose 5 days or more. And stalking victims are typically not a protected class of worker. So in other words, if a stalking victim goes to their employer and says, hey, here's what's going on, could I switch shifts or not answer the phone at the front desk, the employer could choose to be really accommodating and helpful, or they could say, I'm sorry, that's inconvenient for the company, you're fired. Typically they can do that and the stalking victim will have no recourse. Of course, we also see victims losing time from work because of the interference and trauma that they're experiencing from the stalker, so being unable to complete the task of their job. And quite a few relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Still, even if you found a great new place and you're excited and it's all a positive thing, to pack your things and get the movers and get your family ready, it's stressful, it's expensive, it's not something we look forward to. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims making that decision as a result of their victimization. So I think it goes to show how consuming this is and how traumatic it is for survivors. It's always great to hear from survivors in their own words. This is a stalking survivor who said, it's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there. And this quote's really illustrative of how many stalking victims feel, this feeling that it's never really over, that there is no coincidence anymore, that it can always just keep happening again and again. If you think about being in that heightened state of just waiting for the other shoe to drop for years and the kind of impact that that can have, that's what so many stalking survivors are dealing with. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicide, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often these signs of stalking are missed as, oh, it's just texting, it's just annoying, it's just following. In fact, this one wonderful researcher we work with went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. It is these sometimes small, sometimes larger individual behaviors adding up over time and escalating, not always right in one straight line, right, but escalating over time. Now, of course, not every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide, and I'm not saying it does, but what I am tired of seeing is violence and or homicide, and then we look backwards and see, oh, there was a long history of stalking behavior leading up to this event. Instead, what we need to do is identify stalking early when it's going on and stop it there. And stalking gives us the opportunity to do that. It's one of the few crimes where early intervention and identification can prevent trauma, violence, and possibly even death. So we have that opportunity when we understand stalking and we intervene at the appropriate time. And yet it's very underreported. Far fewer than 40%, that's a really high estimate, of stalking victims report to law enforcement. Why do you think that is? If you could tell me in the chat. And right now, my chat is blank, so I'm wondering if I'm seeing it right, or if you're just a very quiet group. So feel free to weigh in there. But I'll start talking through some of the most common reasons. Of course, similar to sexual violence and intimate partner violence, we know that some victims don't report because they are afraid of retaliation. They're afraid of escalating the situation. We know that many of them might distrust law enforcement. Perhaps they had a negative experience before. They may not be believed. Yeah, absolutely. We have victims saying, I have no evidence. I can't prove it. They get called crazy. Yeah, absolutely. So you have victims saying, I'm going to sound crazy when I report this. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But especially for stalking, sometimes if they don't feel they can prove the whole case, it's like, why even bother? And not knowing their rights. Yeah, I think that's a great point, that a lot of stalking victims don't realize this even is a crime that they could anticipate a criminal justice response to. So for all of those reasons and more, we see that stalking victims are not picking up the phone and reporting to law enforcement when this is happening. But let's say they do report, okay? Let's say there is documented evidence. So this was a study in the state of Colorado, about 1,800 cases of domestic violence, almost 300 involved stalking, clear documented evidence of stalking. That can be hard, right? Because it can be hard to prove. So about 1 in 6. So of these 298 cases, how many were charged as stalking, do you think? Any ideas? And unfortunately, it looks like we're having some glitch with the chat, so I'm sorry. Stephanie's being great and relaying some stuff to me, but if I'm delayed in responding to you, that's why. So of these 298 cases, only 1 was actually charged as stalking, only 1 entirely. So more than the 0%, but not much more, right? And this isn't to specifically call out law enforcement, but just to recognize that, stalking it's underreported. Even when it is reported, it's not being held, folks are not being held accountable. This is not being charged the way it should be. But it's okay, we're gonna fix it today by understanding stalking and making sure we educate everyone throughout our system on what this crime is and what the response should be. So what exactly is stalking? I'm saying it's so bad we have to do something. What is it? Well, there's a behavioral definition and a statutory definition. Every state has a different statute around stalking, and so I'm definitely happy to talk you through that. But we're going to focus on the behavioral definition today because that gives us a better sense of what stalking really is and what stalking really looks like. And you might find in your jurisdiction that, okay, this is behaviorally stalking, but it doesn't rise to the level of the statute. That's still important because we want to safety plan appropriately with those victims and respond with the right sense of urgency. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and all of these are bummers, okay? We don't like any of these behaviors. But which ones are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. And so Stephanie's going to pull up this first poll. So a student peeks into the women's locker room and watches whoever happens to be in there undress. Does that sound like stalking to you, yes or no? And I'm being very mean. You can't say maybe. So give you a few more seconds. So it looks like most folks are saying no, and about 1 in 5 people are saying, yeah, that could be stalking. Okay, thanks. Second scenario, there's an ex-partner repeatedly spreading vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking to you? Okay, it looks like, again, splitting the room on that one, still about the same ratio, but more folks are saying yes. Okay, so it looks about 3/4 are saying yes, and about 1/4 are saying no. Okay, and then last but not least, this terrible supervisor who is asking her employee personal questions, mocking him in meetings, sending emails at weird hours, is verbally abusive when he doesn't respond. Does this sound like it could be stalking? Okay, so seeing more, still split the room, but more folks here saying, yes, that sounds like stalking. Okay, well, thanks so much for doing that. Of course, it's nice when we can be in person and have a little bit more of a dialogue about it. But some things might have come up for you when you were just thinking on this on your own. You might have been thinking, well, just how many times would something have to happen for it to be stalking? Or does it have to be directed at one person, or could it be for anyone who happened to be there? So luckily for you, I will answer those questions as I go through the behavioral definition here and use those examples as I explain. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it is a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or a one-off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So it's two or more behaviors that demonstrate what's sometimes called a continuity of purpose, where that offender is trying to get to that victim, and they're engaging in different behaviors to do so. So stalking behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Stephanie because I'm the worst presenter ever, okay? So maybe Monday, I text her all day. Tuesday, I get mad she didn't respond. I smash her headlights. And then Wednesday, I feel guilty, so I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors. Even though some of those are legal, they can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So a lot of stalkers combine independently criminal activities like property damage, vandalism, right, with others that are not. And so when we're working with victims, we want to take a step back and see what else is going on here, because a victim may not think to mention, yes, I was, sexually assaulted, and also they keep texting me, right? That second part may or may not occur to a victim. And so we also see in our criminal justice system, sometimes what's really stalking gets categorized under property crimes, right? And then we don't see the whole picture for a variety of reasons. And so it's about really taking a step back and looking at the totality of behaviors and how these add up over time. And it's directed at a specific person. So if you think that first scenario where someone's peeking into the women's locker room, that might still be a crime, but it's not necessarily stalking for a couple of reasons. One is that's the only incident, and of course I don't say only to minimize that, but if it's a single incident, we need two or more to make up stalking. And also if it's to whoever happens to be in the dressing room at the time, that's not directed at a specific person. Now, it could become stalking. Let's say the offender followed a specific person into that locker room. Or let's say the stalker then takes photos of the women in there, finds them on social media, and contacts them and says, you better XYZ or I'll release these. Okay, so now we could be looking at a stalking and extortion case, right? So it could become stalking, but the act on its own would not necessarily be stalking behavior. That being said, we do often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe, let's say it's an ex-partner stalking the victim, their ex. Victim starts dating someone new. Okay, so now that offender is stalking their ex and the ex's new partner. And so that happens pretty frequently. And certainly an offender might reach out to a victim's family, friends, colleagues, others who might become involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case. So a lot of the victim's community can be touched by this. However, we still see that as directed at a specific person because that offender is trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it. But they're trying to reach that victim. So we see that behaviorally as directed at a specific person, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is a really important element of stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime it's frequently conflated with, which is harassment. So if you think of that third scenario, a supervisor who's being verbally abusive, if my boss is emailing me at 3 a.m. and then yelling at me, calling me names in front of the team at 9 a.m. for not responding, like, she's terrible, I feel angry, I feel disrespected, I should go to HR, and this might be a harassment crime. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but I'm not necessarily afraid of her. But then let's say she starts, I'm pretty sure she's following me home, she's a couple cars back, she texts me a picture of myself walking my dog saying, why are you doing that instead of working? She's texting my husband, I don't know how she got his number. Okay, now I'm scared because this is showing a level of commitment from her that makes me feel fearful. Like, what else is she going to do, or else could this escalate, right? And so harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct or become stalking, but on its own, it's typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel distressed, annoyed, disrespected. And so it's an important distinction. It's not just semantic, because stalking typically from a criminal justice perspective is a higher charge. It also, on campuses, sometimes it brings in Title IX considerations that harassment doesn't. And also just to be able to name accurately what's really going on here. If it's fear, we want to call it stalking, when stalking. And I see this misused all the time. You know, I'll read a news article that says she received 100 death threats. It was extreme harassment. Well, I don't know about you, but when I get my death threats, I'm not just annoyed. I am scared. And so that's really stalking. But what's scary, right? What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. Fear is very personal. And so we're going to watch, this is literally a 5-second video, and think about which of these two folks you identify with more. Apologies to those who don't like spiders. So some of you might feel more like the woman in this video, right, where you're like, oh no, I don't do spiders, I don't play that, we're burning the house down. Her response makes sense to me. But my guess is that quite a few of you also understand where this man is coming from, where it's like, oh my goodness, it's this tiny little spider, you are freaking out, what is the big deal, right? So I'm sorry those hate, and some of you might feel like you're the spider, right? But, you know, a lot of us can understand where this man's kind of, can you calm it down face is coming from. But what if I told you that this woman had been bit by a spider the year before, had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died? Would we still be making this sort of like, calm it down, lady, face at her? Hopefully not, right? Because what did I give you there? Context, information, and context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what's scary to the victim may seem benign or even nice to an outsider. So for example, this is a case this woman called the police. She was hysterical, and all she would say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team on this one. They're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem? And eventually she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out this was a stalking victim who had also been abused by the ex-partner who was stalking her. She had relocated, address confidentiality, the whole thing, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see you, unfortunately, but my guess is a lot of you made a like, sort of face or noise, right? And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. When we know the whole story, it's really scary. But when we just hear there's coffee in the car, it's like, oh, that's nice. How do I get such a car that comes with coffee? That sounds amazing, right? And so we really need to ask the right questions to understand why victims are reacting the way they're reacting. So again, something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you as the responder. So if you're not sure what's going on, we need to ask them, right, sensitively, but say, okay, you know, tell me more about that. What message does that send to you? What's the story behind that? Tell me more about that, because those stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. So the classic example is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? And then the victim receives roses that say work, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, this is so lovely, because they don't know about that specific meaning. So we need to ask. And stalking criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. Again, it's that context that even makes stalking a crime in some cases, and certainly with some of the stalking behaviors that are most prevalent. The truth is there is no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. So in other words, if a victim's afraid, there is probably a good reason. So we're going to watch the next, sorry, we can go back to that. Next 5 seconds of this video and see how this played out, with apologies to those who hate spiders. so you might have already felt that her response was proportional. But for those who were skeptical, it turns out this victim had a great idea of what threat she was facing, right? She very accurately assessed the threat, and it was him dismissing it and saying, oh, it's no big deal. And this is what happens with stalking cases a lot of the time. A victim is very afraid, and whoever's responding is saying, it's a few text messages, it's not a big deal. It doesn't treat it with the urgency and seriousness that it deserves. But is it fear? So a lot of times, if a stalking victim reaches out to you, they're probably not going to say, hi, I'm experiencing a course of conduct directed at me, a specific person, that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking, right? If they do, please notify me. I'll be like, our awareness month is so good. But they're probably not going to say that. They're going to say something more along the lines of, my ex has gotten weird, my neighbor's harassing me, my brother-in-law is making things awkward, right? And so it's up to us to be thinking, could this actually be stalking? Could this actually be fear? We know that victims respond to trauma in different ways. Some might have no affect at all. Some might seem really angry. And they're very likely to minimize the situation, not uniquely, but maybe especially when it comes to stalking. So, for example, I talked to a law enforcement officer who shared with me that they were working with a stalking victim, and the victim called them and said, today's a great day. He's only driven by my house 9 times. And the law enforcement officer was like, what do you mean it's a great day? That's terrible. It's 8 in the morning. Like, what are you talking about? And the victim said, yeah, but usually by this point he's driven by like 25 times. So I think it's going to be like a low-key day. And so it's not that this victim's unreasonable. It's just that this repeated traumatic experience has made things seem normal that most of us would find really scary, right? And so that's where, behaviorally speaking, that reasonable person standard is actually quite helpful, because even if the victim's saying, oh, no, it's fine, that's just what they do, if a reasonable person would feel afraid, we could still think of it as stalking, even if they aren't explicitly articulating that fear. Another helpful way to kind of determine how scary or serious this is to ask victims what they've changed as a result of the victimization. So I've had victims say, well, I wasn't afraid, but I changed my routes to and from work, and I left his photo with the security guard in my apartment building just in case. Okay, so this isn't to call that victim out or anything, but to me, if someone's taking those sorts of steps, that indicates they're not just kind of annoyed by someone, right? They're afraid. This is certainly more distressing than they might be articulating. So that can be a helpful indicator as well. The thing is, I actually hear the word stalking all the time, but not usually correctly, right? So you might have heard or said something like this, like, I was totally Facebook stalking you. I saw you went to Mexico. It looked amazing. Not this year, but like maybe in 2019 this happened, right? So based on this use of stalking, I was stalking you on Insta. Oh my God, I'm running into you. I'm like totally stalking you, that kind of thing. Is this stalking? Yes or no? No, it is not stalking, right? It is, this is a casual use of the term that there's no fear here. Assuming these 3 people know each other and are Facebook friends, it's not scary if I put photos on social media and then people see those on social media. Like, that's what I expected, right? But people use this all the time, and I'll hear people say, Dana, I was totally stalking your photos. I'm like, you can't stalk my photos because they cannot feel fear, because I have many friends and I'm very popular. And I'm not saying that this causes stalking victimization, right, the casual use of this term, but it does kind of dilute the seriousness and the urgency of this and miseducate folks about what stalking really is and is not. And it's a bit unique to this crime. Like, no one says, oh man, that party was so lit, it's arson, right? That's not a thing anyone would say. If you said, I think there was arson at my home, the response from your friend is going to be, okay, you need to call the police. Like, what do you mean there was arson? That's crazy. But with stalking, you get this kind of, was it stalking or was it stalking kind of idea. And so it's something to think about, because I find that even in pretty enlightened spaces, there still is the casual use of the word stalking, and it can impact victims in terms of their ability to identify it as serious and report it. Those informal supports, we know they tell first, their friends, their family, are they taking it seriously, or are they kind of brushing it off? as well as us as responders, because I find that stalking is something that we hear it a lot. We hear the word a lot. So a lot of folks think they know about stalking, but actually don't know what stalking really looks like. They're not really talking about something criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. So just something to think about. So stalking prevalence and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent crime. More than 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. And we know that stalking impacts people of all gender identities. This is the best available nationally representative data, so that's why I'm repeating it to you this way. And so if you think about, domestic violence impacts around 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending what study you're looking at. Sexual assault impacts around 1 in 5 women. Even with this pretty conservative estimate, because we know that all of these crimes are underreported, right? And this had a very high threshold for defining stalking. Even if we take this at its word, more than 1 in 6 women experiencing stalking, it's right up there with intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And yet, it's often this and stalking, first stalking training, often left out of the conversation. So we need to realize that we may not be identifying the victims we're working with as stalking victims, but we are definitely working with stalking victims. All people can experience stalking. We know that women are more likely than men to experience it, and the majority of victims report that the offender is male. So that's true overwhelmingly for female victims. Over 80% of the time the offender is male. It's also true quite a bit for male victims, though. About half the time their offender's male. So why might that be happening? Why, outside of an LGBT context, are men stalking other men? Well, a great deal of it is what I mentioned earlier, that target dispersion, which is, it's an ex, let's say husband, stalking an ex-wife, ex-wife gets a new boyfriend, okay, now that offender is stalking both of them. And we know that stalking happens in the LGBT community, and small studies and anecdotally, it seems the rates might be higher than in the general population, similar to domestic and sexual violence, which makes sense because those crimes are often part of the same behaviors. But we don't have a great national study on it yet, which is why I can't just throw that up here. But if you know of any or see any, please let us know. I just wanted to mention that too. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. So it's a lot of sort of hoodies, strangers, alleyways, lurking. I like this one in the kind of middle left who's wearing a mask and a hoodie and behind a computer but did not cover the webcam. So you certainly get the sense of these sort of lurking hooded strangers. And I'm sure with the work that you do, you will not be surprised at all to know the vast majority of the time the victim knows the offender knows the victim, right? These are mostly known parties. So again, I don't expect you to be surprised by that at all. I will say when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, people are shocked by this because when most people hear stalking, they think about celebrity stalkers. They're thinking about the Kardashians, they're thinking Taylor Swift. And indeed, our stalking laws do come from a celebrity stalking case. It was Rebecca Schaeffer's murder in the 90s in California that led them to pass the first state stalking law. So that's not wrong, but it's typically not really what we're talking about when we're working with victims, survivors, and offenders. And so that's a myth that can be harmful in terms of folks identifying that stalking is what's happening to them. So about half the time overall, the stalker is a current or former intimate partner. But I want to make the point here also strongly that if about half the time they're a current or former intimate partner, that's significant, that's a huge piece. But that also means about half the time they aren't, right? They might be an acquaintance, they could be a stranger, though it's relatively rare, a family member, or a person of authority like a supervisor, an academic advisor, somebody like that. And so I encourage you to think about in your role at your organization, are you serving all victims of stalking, those that are intimate partner related and those that are not? Do you have a clear policy on that? If you're not, do you know where to refer them? If you are, that's awesome. Do they know how to find you? Because if I'm being stalked by, say, a neighbor and there was no intimate partner relationship, I'm unlikely to think to call like the Family Violence Center. or the Rape Crisis Center, right? Because that has nothing to do with what I'm experiencing. And yet we know that that's where the response most likely is, regardless of if the stalking is intimate partner related or not. And so, you know, is the word stalking on your website? Like, do folks know that that's where to go if it is? And do you have staff that are trained and ready to respond to stalking, both intimate and non-intimate partners? So we actually have a checklist on our website of questions like that you can ask and have a fun staff meeting and go through them and think through just, you know, what is your response to stalking victims? Because, you know, both on the criminal justice side, it's the same thing. Typically the stalking response is housed under domestic violence, and that's true on victim services. And that's not wrong, it's just incomplete, and we don't want to be missing stalking victims here. Oh, and here's, sorry, I forgot I had this. Here is, how is your organization address stalking? So here's a graphic of the checklist, and I know Stephanie just put it in the chat, so thanks. So stalking behaviors. Stalking behaviors can be quite varied, and if we wanted to list them all, we would be here all day. Please feel free to share in the chat if there's any specifically that you've seen or cases you've worked on, obviously with victim privacy and confidentiality in mind, that might enhance this point. But one thing I want to say is that a lot of stalking offenders go out of their way to scare their victims, and the behaviors can be so varied. I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are extremely creative criminals. Folks always tell me the most disturbing, bizarre stalking cases are, I'm sorry, the most disturbing, bizarre cases are stalking cases, because definitionally it's someone going way out of their way just to scare somebody else, in often highly personal and contextual ways. So if a victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but you should definitely tune in and be thinking, this could be a stalking case. So for example, I read a case where the offender drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her home. That's a stalking case. I read one just yesterday where an offender mailed a dead rat through USPS to his victim, right? That's a stalking case. It's that kind of thing. Not always, but often. And so it's just something to think about. There are different types of stalking behaviors, and this is a really helpful framework, I think, from T.K. Logan, who's a really wonderful researcher on the crime of stalking, among other related crimes. And she developed this framework to help us just expand our thinking about stalking behaviors, because a lot of times when folks think stalking, they think to surveillance. So you get that sort of binoculars, camera, and that is a part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing, because any two or more behaviors that are scary could be stalking. And so these categories overlap and intersect, and that's fine, but it can help us broaden our thinking on what stalking might look like for different victims. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. It's how is the offender tracking, monitoring, gathering information about that victim. So that could be just following them in person or online through social media, watching, waiting, tracking software like planting a GPS device on their vehicle, obtaining information about them, just kind of watching, where do they check in online, you know, and proxy stalking, which is a fancy way of saying stalking through other people. So we see this, say there's shared custody, right? So, oh, is daddy seeing anyone new? Is mommy taking you on vacation? As well as just asking third parties, you know, how have they been at work lately? Did they get that promotion? You know, that kind of thing, just to gather information. Sometimes those third parties know they're helping a stalker. A lot of times they don't, right? They may not know the situation. And so just some of the surveillance methods here. And I want to say, too, that we do certainly see a lot of stalking through technology, and that's an important aspect to understand. But most, not all, but most stalkers who use technology are also stalking in person. So good old-fashioned going through the trash, going through the mail, showing up, talking to people, those are all really common surveillance strategies that offenders use as well, in addition to the more technologically focused ones. So life invasion is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want that offender to be there. So the victim is trying to get through their day, and there is the stalker or signs of the stalker no matter what they do. So a lot of times that comes out through unwanted contact, right? It could be letters through the mail, it could be text messages, it could be phone calls, it could be emails, or sometimes all of the above. wherever the victim goes. So, they sit down to do their job, they have 100 emails from the offender they have to sort through. So just that kind of constant reminder, I'm always there, I'm always part of your day. Showing up, property invasion. I want to highlight this one because I think it really illustrates sort of the methods of quite a few, not all, but quite a few stalkers. So one common stalking tactic is to break into a victim's vehicle or residence and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they were there. So maybe they leave a can of soda that they always drink that the victim associates with them. They leave the TV on a channel they and the victim used to watch together. They move a lamp, something like that. And so when the victim returns, let's say home, they know that offender's been there. But unless they have their own surveillance system, they feel like they can't prove it and that they'll sound crazy, like some of you mentioned earlier, right, in reporting to law enforcement. They're like, what, I'm going to call the police and say someone moved a lamp? Like, okay, how's that going to go? And offenders know that, and that's why they engage in this behavior, because it's really threatening contextually. They're letting the victim know, I can get to you. But it can be really hard to prove and to talk about. So sometimes we hear victims saying, I become paranoid. Well, they're not paranoid, they're being vigilant. They're being sometimes hyper-vigilant because of what they're experiencing. And of course, harassing friends, family. We know so many victims say, when it was just me, it was fine, but now that my mom's scared, now that my sister's scared, that's not okay. Interference is similar to life invasion, but it's what is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior. So we see a lot of financial and work sabotage. If you just think about all the, say, financial accounts you have online, and if someone who really hated you got in there and wanted to cause some mischief or damage, not to minimize it, what they could do. And so we see that, ruining credit, making purchases, signing them up for things, signing them, unsubscribing for things they need to be subscribed to. We also see just that spreading rumors and ruining reputation. So if you remember, way back when I started talking, we had those 3 scenarios in those polls, and the middle one was an ex-partner repeatedly spreads rumors about an ex on social media. Could this be stalking? And of the 3, I'd say that's the most likely to be stalking, because spreading rumors and ruining reputation and sabotaging the victim are really common stalking tactics. So this is beyond just, people gossip. This is often very intentional and deliberate and harmful on the part of the offender. So, for example, I read a stalking case where the offender photoshopped the victim's face onto nude and pornographic images, wrote a bunch of rumors about what she liked sexually as well as her actual contact information, made a flyer, distributed it to everyone in the victim's workplace and apartment building. Okay, so that is beyond, people gossip, right? Obviously that's very intentional, it's very harmful, it could be scary to her physical safety, but it's also about their reputation. I think I've heard weird things about that person. I don't want to give them that promotion, or I don't want to hire them, or I don't want to date them, or whatever it might be. So that spreading rumors and ruining reputation are really common matters of interference. Also attacking those close to the victim, family, friends, pets, and some very tangible interference, for example, property damage. Okay, trying to go to work, but the offender slashed my tires. Now I have to deal with this. This interferes, right? So we see a lot of interference. And then intimidation. Of course, pretty much everything I mentioned could be intimidating contextually, right? But we do see there's more direct threats as well. Property damage, symbolic violence like a crushed can, forced confrontations, refusing to leave, threatening or actually harming oneself. We know that's something that's really scary for victims and is often really a threat to the victim as well, or threats to the victim about harming them or others, harming pets, harming family members, harming colleagues, etc. So these are just some of the stalking behaviors that we see. And so let's ask our victims if they're experiencing any of these, because just like with the domestic violence or sexual assault, if sometimes you just say, are you being stalked? A victim's more likely to say, well, no, I don't think I'm being stalked. But then if you break it down and ask them more specific questions, you might find that indeed they are experiencing more than one of these behaviors. So to ask, okay, have they ever tracked you? Have they ever followed you? Have they monitored you in any way? Have they repeatedly invaded your life? And so these are just some good questions to ask when you're screening victims who might come in for domestic or sexual violence, to say, hey, is there stalking victimization? as well. Also, because there are so many stalking behaviors, from a criminal justice perspective, there can be multiple charges. And so sometimes we hear people say, oh, there's nothing we can do because no one's been hurt yet. Well, there's plenty of crimes, even if they're minor misdemeanors in your jurisdiction, that are crimes that can add up to a stalking case. So I understand that I'm not your judge, but according to me, if you have, voyeurism and trespassing, okay, let's document those, because you also have stalking now if it was directed at that same person and that person is afraid or would reasonably be afraid. And so when we do trainings for specific states, we always go through your state statute as well as your criminal code and just highlight some of these. But again, think creatively and broadly about what other illegal behaviors might be going on in a stalking course of conduct. Here's some of the most common ones: those unwanted messages, spreading rumors, following or spying. These are some of the most prevalent, but of course there's a variety of different stalking behaviors, and most stalkers use more than one. So they're not just showing up, they're not just texting, they're engaging in more than one means of approach. 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once a week. Many pursue daily. And the average duration of a stalking case, this really shocked me when I learned this, not the high end, the average, is 2 years. And about 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so what that means is that stalkers have plenty of time to start with one tactic. Maybe they're only showing up in person and then they go away for a while, and now they're back emailing and texting and, spreading rumors or whatever it might be. And so when we're thinking about safety planning with victims, we can't only think about what's already happened. We need to think broadly about all those different behaviors, that surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation. And yeah, we can't read the future, but think what might happen next. What else might a stalker do? What else do we think this offender might be capable of? And how can we, as best as we can, realistically anticipate that and safety plan around it? Because it's not just what's already happened, it's what's coming next. Stalking often intersects with intimate partner violence. I already mentioned that about a half of stalking cases are intimate partner violence related, and that can happen in a few different ways. A lot of times in our field, when I hear people talk about stalking, I'll hear them talk about it like this. They'll be like, okay, so it was an abusive relationship, the victim left, and then the offender began stalking that victim. And that absolutely can and does happen. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship that offender was tracking the victim, showing up at their workplace, showing up at their school, asking friends and family where they were, calling them constantly, spreading rumors about them, that's stalking, right? It's domestic violence. It's what we might sometimes call coercive control, emotional abuse, or digital abuse. And it's stalking. It's both. And it can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. About half the time, stalking is happening during the relationship as well, but it's often not picked out as a unique victimization. But it should be, because intimate partner stalkers, on average, are our most dangerous stalkers. So all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, but on average, those intimate partner stalkers are more likely to physically approach the victim, be interfering, insulting, and threatening, use weapons to threaten or harm, have their behaviors escalate quickly, as well as reoffend. So the recidivism rate is high across the board for stalkers. We also know this, and I'm sorry, this looks like it's got cut off a little bit. This is a study of women with protective orders. So all of these women have been abused. Some of them have been abused and stalked. For the women who are abused and stalked, they had higher rates significantly across the board of all of these different harms, from verbal abuse and serious threats to severe physical violence, sexual assault, threats with a weapon, attacks with a weapon, and injury. So I'm not saying that stalking causes these other harms. What I am saying is that stalking is an indicator that this might be an especially dangerous intimate partner violence situation. And so we definitely want to identify it so we can identify that there's an increased risk for that victim or survivor and treat it with the urgency that it deserves. So it is a red flag that there might be more going on here. And again, in the vast majority of intimate partner femicides, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. Stalking also intersects with sexual violence a few different ways. We have a webinar doing a deeper dive of this on our website if you're interested in learning more. But kind of big picture, there are some different ways it can intersect. They might be planning to assault the victim, so they are, watching that victim to find out when are they vulnerable, when are they alone, when can I commit the sexual assault. They might try to get somebody else to sexually assault the victim. So we often see impersonation in our stalking cases. So, for example, there was a pretty well-known case where an offender went on Craigslist, pretended to be the ex, pretended to be the victim, and said, I have a violent rape fantasy, and I want a real aggressive man to come rape me, and if I yell and scream, that's part of it, and here's where I live, and here's what I look like. And unfortunately, because our world is a terrible place, and someone did respond to that ad and assault that woman, the only good news is that both offenders were held accountable, both the rapist as well as the stalker who facilitated that rape. And I wish I could tell you that that was this really off-the-wall, once-in-a-lifetime sort of case you see, but unfortunately, it's very easy to impersonate someone through something like a dating app. Often all you need to set up an account is a photo. So you have a photo of the victim, you set up an email, pretend to be the victim. If you combine that with other types of stalking behavior, so say you're watching the victim and impersonating them. So you say something like, yeah, I'm wearing a red sweater, I'm at the coffee shop, come find me. And then we have that victim being approached by strangers saying, I'm here for what we talked about. So we do see that increasingly as part of a stalking case. Of course, the stalker may themselves sexually assault the victim as part of one of the crimes in their stalking course of conduct. And sometimes the stalking starts with a sexual assault, and then there's intimidation afterwards. So the stalker contacts them after either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two, and then it becomes a stalking case. So why name stalking? I keep saying we have to call it stalking, and you may be thinking, look, I already do critical work with victims, survivors, offenders, like does it matter what I call what's going on? And I will say, I think it does, for this and the following reasons, some of which I've mentioned already. One is around charging and prosecution options, right? So if that victim is going through the criminal justice system or the campus adjudication system, most prosecutors, whoever's playing that role, they like having a menu of options. And so adding stalking is good just for that. Also, prosecutors love this charge when they understand how helpful it can be, and I'll tell you why. So if you're prosecuting, say, domestic abuse, typically they're not going to be able to, during trial, bring in that time 2 years ago that the offender sent a bunch of creepy photos, because they're going to say that's prejudicial, that has nothing to do with this incident of violence that was alleged, last month or whatever. But if you're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct, and all of it becomes relevant, and you can paint a much more complete picture of just how terrible that offender really was. And I've had plenty of prosecutors saying, oh yeah, they didn't convict on the violence, they convicted on, the carving the name in the trees, the cup of coffee in the car. The examples that I've haunted you with, that can haunt the judge and jury too. And so it can be a really effective charge to help hold those offenders accountable. Also, safety planning, like I said, stalking is its own crime. It has its own risks. And so if we just call it emotional abuse and don't identify it as stalking behavior, we might miss that these victims are actually at increased risk and not act with the urgency appropriate for a stalking victim. So we want to know when they're stalking so we can safety plan specifically around that stalking behavior, both what's already happened and what might happen in the future. And last but not least, victim empowerment. Even if a victim does not want to pursue victim services and they don't want to go in the criminal justice system, they just want to know what's happening, right? And so to be able to, instead of saying, my ex is being weird, to be able to actually articulate, I'm experiencing stalking, and that's a real thing, and that's a crime, and there's information about it. Even that can go a very long way for a victim or survivor. So for all these and more reasons, I think it's really critical that we name stalking. So in responding to victims, there's a few major tenets. We need to first recognize that victims cope different ways, and of course we see this with other crimes as well. So by the time a victim gets to you as a responder, they've likely taken matters into their own hands one way or another, and it's good to be open-minded and recognize they might have done that a few different ways. So where do the victims move? Well, they might move against the offender. So they stalk the offender back. They spread rumors about the offender. They try to punish the offender for what they're doing to them. They might move inward. They become very withdrawn, isolated, blame themselves. They might move away. That's why we see so many victims relocate, right? They're just like, let's block this person, let's get away from this person. They might move towards the offender. So, okay, they want to talk to me every day. Maybe I'll talk to them once a week, and that will appease them. How can I, try to negotiate with them, essentially? Or they'll move outward, which is, of course, as victim service providers or law enforcement, what we hope, which is that victims will reach out to those services for external help. But we recognize that these are all rational responses, and you've probably done all of these at different points in your life when you're dealing with an overwhelming situation or person. And so, we want them to get to that move outward stage, but we also want to ask them what else they've done so that we can understand the level of fear and also safety plan around it. Few big tenets, you want to advise disengagement. So that's because the stalker sees any contact as a win. So if the stalker calls 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, don't call me anymore, tomorrow they're calling 101 times because that was a win to that offender. That being said, disengagement is not always possible or realistic. So we've had, there's a case that we got a call about that was being prosecuted, a stalking case, and it came out in trial that the victim had contacted the offender at 2 a.m. and they spoke for 3 hours. And so, of course, the defense is saying, well, how scared could she be if she's so scared? Why'd she call him? And so we asked the victim, and the victim said, yeah, I knew he got off work at the bar at 2 a.m., so I called him, and I could hear him leave work, get into his car, drive home, and fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over to my house, break my windows, and wake my kids up again, right? So she's not calling him because she's not scared. She's calling him to kind of take the temperature, have some control, and that kind of keep your enemies closer ideology. And so, again, it's rational. So we want to do both, advise disengagement and acknowledge to victims that may not always be possible. There are some jurisdictions that will just throw out a protective order if they find out a victim called an offender. And so if there's hard and fast rules about that, let's make sure the victim knows that, but also let's advocate and safety plan and not have it be like a secret that the victim did something bad, because they didn't. They were acting in the best interest of their safety. Documentation is also really critical. There can be so many stalking behaviors. So we often tell victims document, but we don't always tell them how. And so they end up, it was a chilly day in Washington, and it's like, oh man, like we're not going to read this, right? And so one tool that could be helpful is a documentation log. These are available for free on our website in English and Spanish, and you can adapt it. But it's very succinct: date, time, what happened, where did it happen. We have a lot of jurisdictional issues in stalking cases. So, and a lot of victims don't understand jurisdiction. So they feel like I called the police, and they don't realize, well, that police was over the county line, and they're not necessarily coordinating with, your local law enforcement or across state lines. Like I live in the D.C. area. It's very common for someone to, live in Virginia, work in D.C., hang out in Maryland on the weekend. We're talking about at least 3 jurisdictions there. And so that can be helpful to connect the dots. If police were called, the report number and the officer name and badge number. And that's not to get them in trouble or anything, but just to keep track, because sometimes those individual incidents don't sound very consequential if someone's picking up the phone and doesn't know who this victim is. Just saying, oh, I got flowers today. Yeah, okay. But when you connect the dots, you realize it's another link in that chain that is the stalking case. So these cases, these incidents add up over time, but they only add up if we do the math. And a log like this can be really helpful in that pursuit. It's unfair to victims. It's a lot of work for victims to preserve evidence and to have to build their own case. So I'm not saying it is good or right, but a tool like this can be really helpful just in breaking that down. Another really wonderful tool is SHARP, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. This is a risk assessment specifically for the crime of stalking. And so it's free, it's available online, it's linked all over our website, and what it does is it asks, there's about 45 questions. It takes about 10 minutes to do. It's something a victim can do on their own with the victim service provider or with law enforcement. It's a little long for like your responding officer, but for anyone with a little bit more time, it creates a narrative report and risk profile. So it can take a multi-year case and create a 3-page maximum document that says, here's what's going on, here's how the victim feels about it, as well as some safety planning suggestions. And Of course, that doesn't replace individualized safety planning with a victim advocate, but it could be a good place to start. I've seen victim advocates print it out and then add their own notes to that. So you can just go on you can test this out. There's a place to check on the website if you're just testing it out before you go through the whole thing with an actual victim. So I really highly recommend it because it really puts there plain and black and white what's going on and why this victim's scared. It can be a real aha moment for the victim themselves to recognize what's going on from a third party, as well as, of course, with victim confidentiality in mind, to help share resources across all the different folks who touch the response to the issue to get people on the same page. So really highly recommend. Of course, what we need above all, which is much easier said than done, is that coordination, right? We need all of these different parties to be on the same page and recognizing that stalking is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. We need our public to be better educated about stalking so that they identify when it's happening to them, that when they tell a friend, that friend says, hey, let's get help, and doesn't dismiss it. When they do get help, we need our victim service providers to identify it correctly, treat it with a level of urgency it deserves, and safety plan appropriately. We need our law enforcement officers to identify it and charge it and help hold those offenders accountable. We need our prosecutors to take up and successfully argue those charges. We need our courts to have appropriate sentencing. And we need our probation, parole, and corrections folks to continue to hold that offender accountable and keep that victim safe. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And the truth is, our system is not set up for stalking cases. Our system is very incident-based. There's property damage, we respond to the property damage. It's not set up intuitively to respond to what stalking is, which is often a multi-jurisdictional, sometimes multi-year pattern of behavior, including individual elements that are criminal and individually non-criminal, right? It's just not set up for what we need it to do here. And so there's no one whose job it is to make sure that this happens. So it kind of has to be you. In whatever role that you play, being a real advocate for victims, no matter what your official title is, recognizing that stalking is urgent and helping navigate the system and get folks on the same page. Because when that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And every week I read stories about intimate partner homicide or other kinds of homicide, and you look back and there was so many opportunities for intervention, right? And it's not that one person dropped the ball, it's really a system failure. And so we need to all kind of play our parts and do what we can. A few resources to leave us with, and then I'll open it up to questions. SMARC is a project of Equitas, which is a prosecutor's resource for violence against women. So if you're working with prosecutors, if you are a prosecutor, they are a free 24/7 assistance on cases including stalking, but also sexual violence, intimate partner violence, human trafficking. Really wonderful resource. Sometimes we co-train with them for prosecutors on stalking, so just a really wonderful place to go. Tech safety. So NVDB's Tech Safety Net, their Safety Net project, has some really great information on technology and taking control of it and understanding password safety, how some devices can be misused, how to be safer on them. So it's a really wonderful resource. I recommend that everyone download it and learn more about that. The only thing I'll say, which is not a reflection on the resource at all, but just in the bigger context of stalking, is that sometimes stalking victims are told, well, if they're calling you, block their phone number or change your number. Or, if they're talking to you on Facebook, block them on Facebook. But if you play that out for a second, I think you'll realize that stalkers are persistent. If they can't contact the victim one way, they'll probably find another way, and they might actually escalate their behavior and become more dangerous, right? So you change your phone number, now I'm showing up at your house. So this isn't to say that victims should take no steps to protect themselves through using technology or to consider their privacy settings. I think that's a wonderful, empowering, and helpful thing to do. But just to realize it's not as easy as, oh, okay, I'll block them. We need to think through that when we're advising victims. And there's no national stalking hotline, unfortunately. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, which is run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And they can help refer stalking victims to local resources, which, like I said earlier, will most likely be sexual assault or domestic violence resources. So, if you're ever sharing the RAIN hotline and the DV hotline, make sure you're also sharing Victim Connect for victims of stalking. Please don't refer victims directly to SMARC, because All we can do is be really nice and refer them back to Victim Connect. So we have some general information, but we don't do victim services. So Victim Connect is definitely the way to go. Like I mentioned, January is National Stalking Awareness Month. And look, it's only the 8th. You still have plenty of time to spread the word. We have resources ready to go on our website to help you learn, teach, share, and reflect. So I hope that you'll do that and be committed to raising awareness this Stalking Awareness Month and all year round. Everything's ready to go at stalkingawareness.org, so I hope you'll join us in our efforts. Just a few things that Spark offers. Right now we're not in person, but hopefully in the near future, knock on wood, will be in-person trainings, online resources for different practitioners. If there's just a case you're working on that you have questions about, we can talk to you about that. Policy and protocol development. If you're thinking, oh, what is our policy for non-intimate partner stalking victims? Like, we can talk through that with you. And webinars. We offer this same webinar, Context is Key, quarterly, and we do quite a few by request, especially these days. And our website, once again, stalkingawareness.org. And I encourage you to follow us on social media just to help think about stalking year-round. And the easiest way to spread awareness, just share some of our posts and some of our information. This is my contact information. I hope that you'll contact me with any questions. We're a relatively new project. We were funded a couple years ago, and we're working hard to try to give you what you all need to do your work best. So please don't hesitate to reach out if anything would be helpful, individualized assistance, further trainings for your organization, etc. And I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for the critical work that you do. I know that it's easy for me to, sit here and say, well, do this, think about that, ask all the right questions, but you're the ones who are really on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. All of this is easier said than done, and I understand that. So I just want to thank you so much for the critical work that you do, especially in this challenging period, and for your interest and for your attention to this webinar. So I hope this is the first time we're connecting and not the last. Please feel free to reach out anytime. And yeah, thanks so much. And I'll stick around in the chat if there's any content questions that come in. If not, then have a great day and a great weekend. Someone asked, do we have additional information related to cyber stalking? So, it's a good question. We are cautious about what we post about stalking through technology on our website because we don't want to educate stalkers on being better stalkers. And so it's always a really fine line for us where we want to educate folks on how technology is misused and also don't want to, give people ideas. And so we do provide a training on the use of technology to stalk. So if that's something you're interested in, we don't post it publicly. Like we'll have this webinar archived on our website. We won't post a tech webinar publicly, but we do offer that. We can talk about what kind of technology is being used or misused, how do you collect evidence on it, how do you safety plan around it, absolutely. And also the NNED Tech Safety Net, they're a great resource for stalking and intimate partner violence and technology. So they have some really robust resources as well. So that would be a first stop for me as well. If you want to learn more about stalking through tech. We're also part of the Stalkerware Coalition, so there's some information through that as well, specific to stalkerware, also sometimes called spyware, and so there's more of that coming out. So asking, where can you inquire? On our website, stalkingawareness.org, we have a spot to request a training. So you can just fill out a form and request a training. We are funded to provide training to all OVW grantees or potential grantees. So that covers most campuses, law enforcement offices, domestic violence agencies, sexual assault agencies, sometimes mental health providers, sometimes medical care. So it's really a really wide range. So we're very fortunate that we're able to do that with our OVW funding. So if you're thinking, wow, I wish everyone on my staff had heard this amazing webinar, that can come true because it will be archived on our website. But also if you want further training, you can reach out. We do trainings ranging from 90 minutes to multi-day. We also have, we can work with prosecutors, we can work with law enforcement consultants, tailor it to what you need. So yeah, definitely reach out. Let's see, I'm just looking at the questions in here. Someone mentioned it'd be good to have a webinar about how a person can be stalked through the family court system. Yeah, it's a great point. We absolutely see stalking through the court system, just because the victim has to keep showing up, and so for the offender, that's a win. the offender, making the victim face them in court. Absolutely. It's an interesting topic, and you're right. It's one that could be helpful for us to delve more into. So I appreciate that suggestion. Someone asked, will there be a certificate of attendance? Yes, if you contact me here, then I can, I'll create that and send that to you. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions I see. Again, feel free to reach out anytime. Thanks so much to Stephanie, and thank you all for tuning in and for the work you do. Have a great weekend.